Hello, William Shakespeare here again, and today I'd like to talk to you about the plague and how it affected my work and life, and compare it to the circumstances that you now find yourself in. There are some striking similarities. For example, we had no cure, no preventive medicines that we could give to our people, which is where you are at the moment, although I do hope and pray that it won't be long before your wonderful medical practitioners and scientists can come up with a cure maybe, or a vaccine, and you can return to normal life. But we were completely in the dark. In fact, it wasn't until 200 years after I had shuffled off this mortal coil, to quote myself, that it was discovered that it was fleas that lived and bred on rodents, especially rats, that passed on the deadly bubonic plague. We had no idea. What we did know, though, was that areas of dense population was where the plague was most prevalent, and London, being the biggest city in England, was obviously the centre of the plague. There's a number of reasons for this. We had no sanitation. Raw sewage would flow down the streets of London. There was overcrowding, people living on top of each other. We had areas of dense poverty. And of course, this is a perfect breeding ground for rats. You'd see rats running around everywhere, millions of rats in London, each carrying fleas possibly, that spread the bubonic plague. So those that could afford to evacuated London. I, myself, went to Stratford. Queen Elizabeth I was so scared of getting the bubonic plague, she moved her entire court, all the lords and ladies and the servants, everybody, from London to Windsor Castle, further down the Thames out of London. There she built some gallows, and anyone coming from London to Windsor risked being hanged. She took her quarantining very seriously. We did have plague doctors, but they weren't really doctors as you know them. They couldn't offer any medications to make people better if they had the plague. Their primary function was to identify those poor souls who did have the plague. I mean, there were lots of other diseases, of course, smallpox, measles and things going around, and the plague doctors, their job was to identify whether somebody had the plague. If they did, they were then forced into quarantine in their own home with their family. A red cross was put on that door, and that house was barricaded, bolted from the outside. And we employed watchmen who had two jobs. One was to make sure that any house that had a red cross on the door, nobody from that house left that building. What you think, well, how are people going to survive in a locked building? What about sanitation? Well, of course, that didn't matter. They still threw their stuff out the window onto the street. And food, how do they get food? Well, the watchman's other job was, if the people in the house left out the money, they would get the food for them, the bread and cheese, whatever it may be, and some wine, and then they'd hoist it on a rope up to the upstairs window. It was like a forerunner of food deliveries that you might be having at this very moment. The plague doctors looked rather strange. They wore long leather coats, full-length coats. Sometimes they were waxed, sturdy boots, gloves, scarves around their necks, and a hood. The most striking feature, of course, was the masks they wore. They had long, beaky nose and often glass to cover the eyes, and they always carried a cane, a stick, and they could use that to examine the patient without ever touching them. Now, this garb was actually quite effective, not for the reasons that the plague doctors thought, because they were limiting their contact with the patient, but the fact was they were covered head to toe. There was no skin exposed at all, and so fleas couldn't bite them. In fact, they were more at danger when they got off the job, got home, took off all this protective gear, put on their singlet and doublet, hose, whatever, then the fleas could bite them. We did have some remedies for the pestilence, as they were called, but they weren't very effective. One was you'd take yarrow, tansy and featherfew, 3 different kinds of herbs, put them into a bowl, give that bowl to the patient and ask them to make water into it. I'm not going to explain that now, I'm sure you get the idea. And when they'd done that, they'd give you back to you, you'd strain it into a glass, and then the poor sick person would drink it. Another one was you take sage, rue, elder and briar leaves, and you'd crush them into a bowl, and this time you'd add a quart of white wine. You'd sieve that, add a bit of treacle. Didn't work either, of course, but it tasted a lot better than the first one. Oh, talking of taste, Anne's calling me. I think it's time for my tea. She's ready, right, so what I'm going to do is have a cup of tea, and while I'm doing that, what I'd like you to do, if you could, is perhaps you could find some paintings or drawings of a plague doctor and copy them, maybe just do the mask, whatever you like. And maybe you can find a photograph or something online, I believe it's called, of a medical practitioner from today. And underneath you can list what each tried to do to prevent the disease that they were fighting spreading. There's lots of similarities and some different ideas. So I'm grabbing a cuppa. While I'm doing that, you get on with that, and I'll come back in a minute or two and talk about what life was like after the plague. After 2 years of isolation in 1594, the plague finally was over. People were allowed back out onto the streets, out from their homes. The pubs opened, the public houses, the eating places, the churches and the theatres. And the population was desperate for entertainment. At that time, I finished some of my most popular plays, including Romeo and Juliet, Midsummer Night's Dream, Richard III. And if you can imagine, well, what you've been going through for the last month or so, imagine doing that for 2 years, stuck in your little house. You can't go out. If you go out, you risk catching something. Maybe you put a bit of cloth and vinegar and you go and get your bread and milk or whatever and rush back to the house for 2 solid years. And remember, when you got home, there was no entertainment of any kind. We didn't have laptops and televisions and radios and all those wonderful things that you have, mobile phones and so on. We just had a candle and a book for 2 solid years. Then the plague's lifted, you can go out, and it coincides with the growth of a new wonderful thing called live theatre. For 1 penny, you can go to the Globe Theatre, and instead of sitting in a dark room reading a book, you can hear music, live music. There's colourful costumes. There's wonderful stories of love and romance, of tragedy, of power and greed, of kings doing terrible things, all for 1 penny. We sold out every performance at the Globe, and I was a made man. Unfortunately, our joy at being back on the streets again didn't last for very long. But just a couple of years later, the plague struck again. It was even more virulent and killed more people. Fortunately, it didn't last as long as the one that ended in 1594. There's something you can do for me now, a bit of research if you wouldn't mind. What I'd like you to do is to find out when I wrote each of my plays. There's various ways I'm sure you could do that. And also, find out when the plague struck in England. Now, I was born in 1564 and I shuffled off, as I mentioned, in 1616. So there's a 52-year span between 1564 and 1616. Find out when the plague hit Europe, and particularly England during that time. If you then work out when I wrote my plays during the plague, it may give you some insight. I was writing these wonderful plays at a time of desperate fear for myself, really, of maybe I might be the next plague victim. And I'll give you an insight on how the plays were written. So I'd like you to go and do that now if you can. And when I come back, I'll say goodbye and maybe send you something else to do as well. Back in a moment. Now, I'm sure there's lots of things you're missing while you're stuck in quarantine, and perhaps some things you'd taken for granted before you were forced to stay away from them. So what I'd like you to do now, when I finish my little chat, is to write down a list I'd like you to write down a list of the things you're most looking forward to doing again. It may be spending time with family and friends, having a party perhaps, going to a sporting event or playing sport, travelling to the beach. Whatever it is, I want you to write a list of the things that you're so looking forward to doing again once we're given the all clear and the virus is gone. And also you could write down a second list of things you'd like to do, hopes maybe, places you'd like to go, things you'd like to do in your life. And keep that list safe. And then you can start ticking them off and see if you fulfill all those ambitions and dreams. Because life is very precious. And when you're out there, please enjoy every moment of it. So, that's enough of me, I think, for now. So I'll say, keep well, stay safe, and God bless. I hope you've enjoyed my little chats and found them informative. If you have, please hit the subscribe button down below. And if you like, you can hit the like button, whatever that means.